All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another in the long series of sessions that is the Environmental Justice Symposium 2021. Today we have here with us Dr. Erika Weinthal. It's weird to say her first name. She's one of my professors, Dr. Weinthal. Just going to introduce her. Dr. Erika Weinthal is a Duke Environmental Policy and Public Policy professor, where she specializes in global environmental politics and environmental security with an emphasis in water and energy. Her research spans numerous geographic regions, and she has been honored as the 2017 recipient of the Women Peacebuilders for Water Award because of her work in this field. And I'll just say, as a student of hers, her class is fantastic on global environmental politics. So hopefully you all get a taste of that today. I will let her take it from here.
Okay. I am going to share my screen, and everybody can hear me, I presume. Share screen. Okay. So what I'm going to do today, since I was given, carte blanche, like do whatever you want. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I am just I put together slides that touch on upon a lot of different themes related to water, justice, and rights. And I take a very, very broad perspective when I talk about justice and rights. And in many ways, it encompasses all of my work, but often through a governance lens. I'm trained as a political scientist, so I think about the politics that undergird why inequities exist, inequalities exist, injustice exists. So it's through this lens of trying to understand the institutions and governance mechanisms that really define the extent to which people have access to clean water and adequate water globally. And I'm going to focus here really on water, even though I do work on other natural resources. Okay, so water. When we talk about water, it's just to begin, it's important to understand some of the parameters that define the constraints that people face in access in particular. Water is a scarce resource, and it's not distributed evenly across the globe. There are some places that have very heavy rainfall and others that are very water scarce. But even in countries that may have heavy rainfall, it may be very uneven, that you may get monsoons during certain times of the year, and then it's very dry during other times of the year. Water is often also shared. This is a picture of the Jordan River. We often think of the Jordan River as this very mighty river, but it is also a very, at times it's very limited. And the thing that distinguishes water more than any other natural resource is that you can't live without it. At the end of the day, there are substitutes for other natural resources. We can find alternative energy resources, but there is absolutely no alternative for water, especially for clean water. We can also talk about water poverty. Over 780 million people around the world don't have access to improved sources of drinking water, and about 2.5 billion lack improved sanitation. And so this in many ways motivates my work, trying to really understand how we can live in the 21st century in a context where people still don't have clean water coming out of their faucet. And even in parts of the world where they may have water that comes out of the faucet, it's not drinkable. So recently, very recently, just the other day, the president of the UN General Assembly said it is a moral failure that we live in a world with such high levels of technical innovation and success, but we continue to allow billions of people to exist without clean drinking water or basic tools to wash their hands. And this has become even more pronounced during the pandemic, when we think about the importance of having access to clean water and hygiene. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed also noted that by 2040, 1 in 4 of the world's children under 18, about 600 million, will be living in areas of extremely high water stress. So this is a topic that is incredibly important. It should be very high on any country's foreign policy agenda. And it's not just a global issue, and this is one of the things I really want to undergird. A lot of my work is global, where I think about these issues in many parts of the world, but it's also something that is very close to home in the United States. The UN Human Rights Council, a number of years ago, designated a special rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, Katerina Del Albuquerque. She came to the United States, met with one of our colleagues, Catherine Flowers, and visited Lowndes County in Alabama, where in her report to the Human Rights Council, she noted that what the Alabama Department of Health had estimated that the number of households in Lowndes County with inadequate or no septic systems ranges from 40 to 90%, and that about 50% of the conventional on-site septic systems are currently failing. So this issue of lack of access to water and proper sanitation is also something that exists in the United States, even though we often think that the United States has clean water and has properly functioning septic systems, and our numbers have often looked good in comparison to other countries when measured according to the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. But this is also a very pressing problem in the United States and should not be overlooked. So one of the areas that motivates me with my research has often been, where do people get their water? And it varies across the world. Often we think of water coming from the tap, clean water connected to municipal systems. But in many parts of the world, people have to go out and get water and carry it back to their homes, either through, the use of jerry cans, tankers. People store water on their rooftops. These are pictures from a recent trip of mine to Amman with the storage of water containers. Other people have to buy bottled water, including in the United States. And then what we often forget too, in the United States, many people are connected to private wells. And if you are connected to a private well, it means you are actually not regulated according to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So many Americans have no idea if your water comes from a private well, what is in your drinking water. So what is in your water? I'll just show one picture. This is an old study from the Gaza Strip. In Gaza, there's very high levels of chloride. It's very saline water. It also has very high levels of nitrate, which has been associated with blue baby syndrome. And the water there does not meet the EU World Health Standards, but also doesn't meet even the standards in Israel, which are much more relaxed. In North Carolina, we have very high levels of arsenic in the groundwater. So if you have a private well, you may be drinking water with high levels of arsenic if you do not test your water. And that testing depends upon individual homeowners testing their water. So what does it mean, poor water quality? This, from a global perspective, this threatens human security. It can undermine economic development, can endanger peace. Old stats, worldwide about 3.4 billion people die annually from waterborne illnesses, and it affects children disproportionately. Other issues that come up when we talk about, water as a human right, access to water has to do with water affordability. Often water is, the price of water is too expensive, or clean water becomes too expensive for many communities. We have seen conflict erupt over the commodification of water resources. So in Cochabamba, Bolivia, we talk about the water wars in April 2000, when they sought to try to sell the water system to a multinational company that, in exchange for extending access, raised the price of water, which made it completely out of reach for local residents. And it led to people demonstrating in the streets over the price of water. Other issues also, when we talk about the commodification of water, we often talk about water pricing versus water as a human right, whether water should be freely available. And this comes up in many different contexts. There's been increasing heat waves in the Middle East in 2016. In the absence of, in Palestine, where water was cut off to a number of villages, people had to buy tanker water. Tanker water is much more expensive. Bottled water is much more expensive. And so these create different types of conflicts over access. So it's over just straight access, but also over access to clean water and access to affordable water. And then I'm going to talk a little bit now, transition about sharing water, because much of the water worldwide is shared between states. And it's not shared, there's an unequal distribution globally. The colors, hopefully it's sort of the peach colors, are where you see smaller amounts of renewable water supply, much more scarce water globally per person. Transboundary aquifers are also shared across countries. So the DC aquifer is shared between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The Nubian sandstone aquifer is shared parts of North Africa. And then you have states that share transboundary water resources. So the Nile is one of the more well-known international rivers. And this is a water system that is shared between 11 riparians. It is now 11 riparians following the creation of South Sudan, following the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement that led to the creation of South Sudan. So there's Sudan and South Sudan now. But this has been an issue because this is, let me go back. The Nile is essentially has been regulated by a peace treaty, by a water treaty, I should say, not a peace treaty, a water treaty between Egypt and Sudan, of which 80% of the water resources are allocated to Egypt, and then the other 20% to Sudan. But we're talking about 11 riparians in this water basin. And so that means 9 of them are not part of this early water sharing agreement. And over time, what happens too, in many circumstances, is countries' interests and needs change. So we should never look at a water system as static. And often in international river systems, it's often the downstream states who first begin to use a water system, and it's largely for agricultural purposes. So the Nile Delta, I mean, it's the breadbasket of Egypt. It's the agricultural part. But over time, the upper riparians often also want to use water for their own purposes, be it agriculture or often for hydroelectricity. And so increasingly, we've seen upstream states such as Ethiopia push to build large hydroelectric plants to generate electricity. And this will change the water sharing dynamics in the Nile Basin. And so there's been a lot of attempts over the years to try to bring these states together through the Nile Basin Initiative that's been coordinated through the World Bank to renegotiate a water sharing agreement. Ethiopia has been moving forward with the Grand Renaissance Dam. It started to fill this dam, which will affect the water flow downstream to Egypt. And so this is a whole other set of issues that comes up when we talk about water rights. Like, who has water rights in the Nile Basin? Should it be the downstream states that were the first ones to use the system? Or do we need to think about different needs and the demands of different populations and how that changes over time? And these are also relevant issues for development. The Mekong Basin, China has been building lots of dams. Three Gorges is the most notable. And, there was a study, a study on dams many years ago. But at that time, what they found was that dams have submerged large territory, but has displaced between 40 to 80 million people globally. And so dams also have large socioeconomic impacts. On the one hand, they're really important for fueling development, if we talk about economic development, and providing electricity, because many of these countries may not have had electricity. So this is a way to provide energy access. But they also have social impacts in that many of these areas that are flooded lead to the displacement of peoples. And so how do then countries look at these trade-offs between development and human displacement? So another area that I work on that's relevant for the understanding of water rights and justice has to do with the weaponization of water and water infrastructure in war. So as I said, I'm a political scientist. I worked a lot in the area of environmental security, international security, peace and conflict studies. And so a lot of work in water is often looked at how water can lead to cooperation, that it can be a tool for cooperation. But increasingly over the last decade, what we're seeing is the weaponization of water, especially in the Middle East and the wars that have taken place since 2011 primarily, but going back even longer if one looks at protracted conflict. So there's a very, very long history of targeting water during conflict. Going back to World War II, the Allies did it in Germany, taking out Germany's water treatment facilities. The Soviets did it in Afghanistan, destroying traditional forms of irrigation systems, the Kores. Liberia was the same, taking out a hydroelectric facility that was very important water supply in Monrovia. Other examples, Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli had a scheme to divert the Arno River away from Florence, so it affect the rival in Pisa. And then I'll show a slide in a second. Saddam Hussein, to punish the Shiite population in the south, drained the Mesopotamian marshlands. So an example of recent conflicts, attempts to control large dams. In Syria, this is a very old photo from an exhibit that I went to of the marshlands in Iraq. But this this picture, the satellite picture, captures how the marshlands were drained following the first Gulf War as punishment for their support of the U.S. coalition in the first Gulf War. So this is water systems being used as a tool to punish populations and to displace populations. Work I've done in Gaza looks at the targeting of water resources there too, where we try to create a database to look at that collects information on targeting of water, energy systems, healthcare systems, for example. But you can see in the two main conflicts over the last few decades, 2008, 2009, 2014, water systems were heavily targeted. And over time, this affects the quality of drinking water and the supply of drinking water to the population, where we're seeing the percentage of access to safe drinking water dwindling to almost, to very, very small amounts at this point. Why does this matter? Why should we be focusing on, the destruction of infrastructure, access to water, especially in conflict? And again, this goes back, I think it's really relevant for today. Post-World War I, you had the influenza outbreak. And part of this was you had mass movements of people after World War I, II in Europe. And without access to good drinking water, you have people on the move. And so this can help, it contributes to the spread of infectious disease, In many conflict-affected regions, we see recurring cholera outbreaks. Yemen is the most notable of recent times, having one of the most disturbing cholera outbreaks. So how do you think about water in a post-conflict setting? There's been a lot of work on rights-based approaches, but also thinking about rebuilding and looking at water as a human right as part of the reconstruction process. And I think South Africa has always provided an interesting case as we start transitioning away. So this is my, a little bit of hope in thinking about how do we integrate water as a human right and human rights-based approaches into governance systems and rebuilding. So the Constitution of South Africa states that everyone has the right to have access to sufficient food and water. The Water Services Act addresses water in many ways, essentially providing for a minimum amount of water for the entire population. And this was very innovative. And I should note, it's had lots of problems and it's been very flawed in its implementation. But the basic concept in many ways should give us pause to think about how one thinks about the operationalization or the implementation of water as a human right. This notion of, are there mechanisms in place where we could guarantee everyone access to water as a basic human right? And then what this entailed was, at a certain point, if you start to use more water, then you pay for that service. You pay for it, becomes priced. And so it's this mix of free access and then water as a commodity, the service of water as a commodity. Unlike, the Bolivia context that took away water as, a human right and tried to commodify it. This also matters, when we think about our own use. I like, just as a reminder, we as US citizens use a lot of water per day, 80 to 100 gallons, 300 plus liters per day. But for those that are in refugee camps, what the United Nations High Commission on Refugee says is that they recommend 20 liters per day, but often they may get less than that, somewhere from 7 to 10, whereas peacekeeping forces will need 84 liters. So there's these inequities across the globe, if you think about who has access and who uses how much water. Also what we see is in many countries that have had conflict, those that are most conflict affected countries have been the farthest away from meeting the Millennium Development Goals about extending access to clean drinking water and proper sanitation. So where's there been, I'm going to conclude with just where there's been some progress over the last decade or 2 decades, going back to 2002, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights adopted or passed this general comment that said the human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. And then the UN General Assembly passed the human right to water and sanitation in 2010. So we're seeing this movement of formalizing a human right to water. It's part of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 6. But one should also, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to look at how they intersect with all the other goals. So having clean water and sanitation is also important for gender equality, for promoting gender equality. It's important for reducing poverty. It's important for good health and well-being. So meeting the goal for clean water and sanitation helps support so many of the other sustainable development goals, including goal number 16 for, if you're interested in conflict affected societies, for building peace, just and strong institutions. The UN also declared this is the Water Action Decade from 2018 to 2028. and, meeting the SDGs for access, again, what I mentioned before, this just disaggregates the ways we think about the targets. But also where we're seeing some really interesting innovations. There's over 150 countries now that have enshrined into their constitutions the right to a healthy environment. For me, this is just shocking and impressive, this trend in how we're seeing movement. As you can see on the last map from 2017, the United States has not done this. So we are one of the few countries that does not have within our constitution this notion of a right to a healthy environment. And this is tied, as I was saying to Cameron, we're going to talk about this in class on Tuesday, this notion of other laws about protecting access to information, because part of having access to clean water is tied to all these other procedural rights, not just substantive rights, but procedural rights about having access to information, public participation, access to justice and non-discrimination. And you can also see this movement happening globally. And so with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinthal. That was great. Thank you. If the audience has any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask as well. So I'll give a little bit of time for that. All right, so our first question is as follows. Is there an existing political push in the US to guarantee a basic level of water access to US citizens? Do existing constitutions that guarantee water access also guarantee access to water that is unpolluted with chemical pollutants, example lead, not only pathogens?
So we have definitely a different approach to regulating water quality, and that's really through the Safe Drinking Water Act, which provides protections for ensuring access to clean drinking water. There has not been the same push to having a human right to water in the United States enshrined in our Constitution. As one can imagine, trying to change the United States Constitution is not an easy thing. That said, there is room for local communities to work on, water pricing, working with local municipalities. I mean, what makes the United States so different is we're so complicated and we have so many layers of water management. I think, the issue that concerns me the most is often the people who are left outside of the regulatory process in the United States. So people who are on private wells, and there is no protections put in place for them. And when these exemptions came into place, part of this had to do with not making it too expensive for rural Americans to have to put into place water treatment systems. So it gave them an exemption for small communities that it would become too expensive. But because of that, there are many people who just have no idea what's in their drinking water. And there's a disincentive to try to regulate that and force people to test their water before they sell a house, because if your water has arsenic, it can affect your the price of your home.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Elaine Tutman. I am concerned that an oil pipeline is a serious risk to the Ogallala aquifer. Water for drinking, bathing, agriculture, etc. Is this a valid concern?
So, I mean, pipelines can leak, and I don't work on this particular issue, so I don't know the details. But I can talk, where I do work when it comes to the energy sector has been more on, it's been more overseas. and often around the development of oil sites, you do have lots of contamination of water, water systems. So, areas that I know better, the Niger Delta has been heavily contaminated. Or you also have, North Dakota. There's been lots of examples of contamination and leaks from oil development there. And so it's, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, there's a movement to try to think about how one could use recycled wastewater from the oil and gas sector for the agricultural sector. And so this is an issue that comes up in California. So it's a different set of issues about the reuse of produced water from the oil sector for the agricultural sector, and this does exist. And so there have been concerns about whether this could, have any health concerns for food that people eat. But if properly treated, is this still a risk or not? These are questions that people are looking at these days.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions from the audience. Oh, yes, totally all right to unmute.
Thanks so much for a fantastic talk. I wanted to follow up on your answer about the Safe Drinking Water Act in the US. And this is about my ignorance, not understanding the layers to access versus safety. So my understanding is that in the US, the Safe Drinking Water Act guarantees safe water. It doesn't guarantee water access. And I don't even know what level of regulation would be required to guarantee access. Would that be under the Department of Interior, investment in public infrastructure to get everybody onto the water grid, but not at their personal expense? Are we talking about legislation that guarantees that water utilities can't shut off water if people can't pay their water bills? What is it that we need to do in the US, in your opinion, in order to guarantee not just safety, but access?
Okay, so I wish my colleague was here. I am less of a US person than a global person when it comes to water. I know private wells really well because that's the one area that I've worked on. And there are parts of the US that are just unregulated. In many ways, like if you're not, Safe Drinking Water Act it regulates safe water. But if you're not part of a formal municipality, you're off the grid. And so you are, where I live, it's private wells. And so people are responsible for their own well water. And it's a very different system than if you're in a municipality where you have access to municipal water. So I don't want to make general comments because this isn't my particular area, the extent to which I could talk about private wells more, if you'd like me to talk about that.
No, that's okay. I really appreciate it. And I completely understand if global access is really more your area of expertise. Thanks for your time.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind, in the context of, I guess the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. When we're talking clean, safe water, not necessarily clean water, but safe water, and who determines? I think this might be like a one-word answer, perhaps, but who determines the threshold by which it's considered safe? I just know, in the greatest examples I have are in the United States with regard to hog waste and drinking water, and people are whatever permit applications people are going through are not preventing pollution in groundwater as a result of hog waste, or even uranium mining on the Navajo Nation. I'm just curious who is determining what is considered safe.
So there's the WHO standards. And then countries can determine their own. So sometimes it doesn't line up. But for the Millennium Development Goals, it was the Joint Monitoring Progress, the JMP, which, if I'm correct, was JMP was probably WHO and I want to say UNICEF, but I may be wrong there, who basically determined whether countries were providing being able to cut in half the amount of populations that did not meet, that did not have access to safe drinking water.
And a quick follow-up.
WHO and UNICEF, yeah.
And a quick follow-up, just because the two examples that I mentioned in US context tend to also be environmental justice concerns. You're dealing with historically marginalized communities, indigenous communities, BIPOC communities. And I'm curious if that's a trend that's also seen itself. You mentioned like the work has gone into perhaps half of the countries or half of the communities that previously had unsafe drinking water now do. Are the people still left without? Do they tend to be perhaps lower income communities? Are you seeing that sort of disparity in your work from a global context?
So often when we talk, like, so it's changed over time. The original MDGs looked at things that were, do they have access to a faucet, to a tap? Do you have to a latrine that has a slab? And they didn't look at issues of water quality or affordability in the same way. It was very much about how you could measure access to safe water or clean water. And so you could live, but one of the examples that we always bring up is Amman, just because you can have, live in an apartment, have a tap, where you can get water. So you would be meeting the MDG, but it doesn't come out 24/7 because there's periods of time where there's just is no water. You don't know what's in the water, so you have to boil it. And so it's these are issues that I think are more prevalent, across, layers of society. Those that, have more resources could then buy bottled water. They can supplement. And this is where it just depends, where you live. In some ways, there are other parts of the world where people just don't have access to water. So communities in the South Hebron Hills in Palestine have zero access because they're not hooked up to any water, municipal system in Palestine.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? All right, I think we can wrap up
It's
here.
a Saturday evening or late afternoon. I get it. I'm not.
If I could, I have one dumb question that just popped in my head. Because when you describe, say, this wealth gap with regard to like, you can just buy bottled water if you have more. If people have seen the Lorax, the movie, or read the book, but like the movie had this really interesting depiction of buying clean air in a bottle. It's sort of, and that was the way the movie portrayed it. It was so terribly unethical. You should not have to buy bottled air. And I think it's interesting, kind of bottled water is normal. Do you have thoughts on, I guess, and I think you probably touched on it, but like the commodification of water, like bottled water as a concept, very much given your talk reminds me of the concept of bottled air in that shouldn't be a thing.
So I hate the concept of bottled water. And I drink my water from my well, but I have my water tested because I know that I should do that. And, my neighbors have also, we've organized to have people get their wells tested. But there is, now because of incidents like Flint, there is distrust in our water system, which for me is very problematic, because most municipal systems should be providing safe drinking water. You will get in the mail a report that tells you what's in your water. And they will tell you if there is an outbreak and when you need to boil your water. And so, it may just taste more chlorine. If anything, the taste may not be as, just because they're treating it. But most, the fact that people don't trust their water is very concerning, because it also means they don't trust those that are servicing the water and governing and responsible for the provision of drinking water. And so I think that's where we need to do a lot of work, because we should not be drinking bottled water, really. If government is working, there is no need. Other parts of the world, they don't have a choice at times, because they are not able, they haven't put in place the proper treatment, or they haven't been able to extend, drinking water everywhere. And even there, it's, problematic too, when people have to buy water from informal tankers and there's no oversight on what people are distributing through those informal tankers. So this is an area where we shouldn't be in this situation today.
Thank you so much. Sorry to keep us on for another couple minutes. It just popped into my head. I was like, let's just put it out there.
No, I think that's a really great question, because like personally, I keep trying to go to reusable bottles, but like I have this like anxiousness that the water won't be clean enough. I mean, like part of it's because like I have OCD tendencies, but like I think that's that is something that like I'm now thinking about it, like I shouldn't have to be worried about that, even though it is irrational, but like still.
I drink water in more places than probably most people, and if I'm concerned about the water, I boil it. Or in the past, I traveled with iodine tablets, or I traveled with a water filter. But there's ways to also travel and treat water. But that's a whole other talk I could give on.
That's good advice.
What you can put in your backpack to treat water.
Yeah, we actually have one more question in the chat. Are there media? Oh, sorry.
No, I know Emily.
Are there media outlets you think do a better job covering water politics with nuance and like clarity?
So there's Circle of Blue that focuses just on water. The Guardian has been quite good in some of their water coverage, and they are actually now partnering with Catherine Flowers to do a whole series of articles on communities that don't have proper sanitation. So that I would be on the lookout for that. It should be very exciting. And yes, hello from the farm. Duke Farm makes me happy. And I'm trying to think where there's just a lot of, where do I get all my water news? I'm subscribed to so many lists. There's the Geneva Water Hub that does really interesting work on international water. I mean, there's a lot of sources that I could probably just open up my inbox and throw them out at you at some point. So if you want to follow up, I'm happy to send some.
Amazing. Thank you, Erika. And sorry, our internet is ever questionable at the farm. But I'm really grateful.
I'm happy to see the farm is starting to pick up for summer.
Yeah, absolutely we are. And we have had some luck doing some interesting virtual co-learning by trying to pull in different kinds of media sources that maybe strike that balance between on a range of different food systems topics. And we frankly have not taken a dive into the obvious relationships between water and food, and like meaning, you know, agricultural cultivation. And we're always on the hunt for that kind of like the unicorn pieces that are palatable and approachable to a not maybe highly scientific, everyone has to have a PhD reading a research memo, but also not so overly simplified that you are getting something kind of gritty and meaty and coming away with some technical knowledge. So definitely going to keep an eye out for this Guardian series. And we'll also look at that Circle Blue.
Yeah,
Thank
Circle
you.
of Blue.
Circle of Blue.
Yeah, they just do water. Yeah, I mean, there's
Thank
other
you.
places that do topics like China Dialogue, but it's focused on China.
Mm-hmm. And I hear what you're saying too, like listservs galore, probably newsletters, which people put a lot of time into curating. So I appreciate that reminder too.
All right. If there are no other questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Dr. Weinthal. That was a great talk.
I have to just say hi to Anna. I know you're there. I see your name. It's been a while. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you. Thank you so much for speaking today. This was a good way to spend my Saturday afternoon.
I know it's being recorded, so I don't want you to, but send me an email and let me know how you're doing.